Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The boy arrived at the leather shop on a Tuesday morning when the city smelled of horse dung and salt wind from the Delaware. He carried nothing but the clothes he wore and a hunger that had been his companion for 3 days. Master Cornelius stood in the doorway, arms crossed, examining him as one might examine a hide for flaws. "Can you follow instructions without questioning?" the master asked. "Yes, sir." That single word purchased 7 years of his life. The shop occupied a narrow building on Market Street, wedged between a cooper and a tavern that never seemed to close. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of tanned leather, neat's foot oil, and beeswax. Tools hung on the walls like strange instruments of music. The boy had never seen so many knives in one place, each shaped for purposes he could not yet imagine. He would learn them all, every curve and edge, until his hands knew them better than his own face. Master Cornelius was not cruel, but neither was he gentle. He believed that leather, like character, must be shaped through pressure and time. The boy spent his first months doing work that had nothing to do with the craft itself. He swept floors. He fetched water from the public pump. He stirred the rendering pots until his arms ached and the smell of animal fat seemed to live inside his nostrils. When he complained once, just once, the master looked at him with something that might have been amusement. "A man who cannot endure small discomforts will never master anything worth mastering." The lesson took root, though the boy did not yet understand its full meaning. 2 other apprentices worked in the shop. Robert was 16, already skilled enough to cut patterns without supervision. He had the confidence of someone who knew his place in the world and found it acceptable. The other was James, just a year older than the boy himself, with quick hands and a quicker tongue that often earned him the back of the master's hand. James showed the newcomer how to avoid the worst of Cornelius's moods, which corners of the shop to hide in when customers grew loud, and where the master kept the day-old bread he pretended not to notice when it went missing. "Never trust a man in a powdered wig," James whispered one evening as they cleaned tools. "They'll smile at you in the morning and have you whipped by afternoon if it suits them." The boy filed this away, with all the other lessons that had nothing to do with leather. The work itself revealed its secrets slowly, like a language learned one word at a time. First came the cutting, learning to read the hide for its strong places and its weak ones. A good piece of leather had a grain, a direction, a memory of the animal it came from. You could not force it against its nature. You could only guide it toward the shape it was willing to become. The boy's first attempts were clumsy, his cuts wandering, his stitches loose as a drunkard's gait. But his hands, still growing into themselves, began to understand what his mind could not yet explain. By his second year, he could prepare a hide from raw state to finished piece. The process was long and filled with smells that made his eyes water. Soaking, scraping, treating with lime, and then with tannin drawn from oak bark. Each step required patience. Rush it, and the leather would be stiff and useless. Take too long, and it would rot. There was a rhythm to it, a dance between waiting and doing. Master Cornelius taught him stitching on scraps first, showing him how to punch holes at precise intervals, how to wax the thread so it would slide through cleanly, how to pull each stitch tight enough to hold, but not so tight it would tear. The boy's fingers bled often in those early days. The master noticed, but said nothing. Blood was part of the price. The shop's customers were a study in the city's hierarchy. Wealthy merchants came to order custom saddles, their servants trailing behind carrying coins that jingled with a sound the boy found almost musical. They spoke to Master Cornelius with the casual authority of men who expected their desires to be fulfilled without question. The master bowed slightly, wrote down specifications, and named prices that made the boy's head spin. £3 for a saddle? A craftsman could live a month on such money. Then there were the middling sort, shopkeepers, ship captains, small landholders from across the river. They haggled over every shilling, examined every stitch, and paid in coin they counted twice before handing over. The master treated them with professional courtesy, but no special warmth. Business was business. And at the bottom, people like the boy had been before his apprenticeship. They came for repairs, not new goods. A broken strap, a worn buckle, a harness held together with hope and poor stitching. Master Cornelius charged them little, sometimes nothing at all. The boy noticed this, filed it away as another mystery of adult behavior. Philadelphia itself was a character in the boy's education, as present as the leather and the tools. The city stretched along the Delaware with a geometry that still surprised him. Streets ran straight and crossed at right angles, unlike the wandering lanes of other places people spoke of. Buildings rose in brick and wood, their windows watching the endless parade of carts, horses, sailors, merchants, servants, and slaves who made the city breathe and sweat and argue with itself. From the shop doorway, the boy could see a slice of Market Street's endless theater. Women carried baskets of vegetables. Men shouted news of ship arrivals. Children darted between wagons, playing games that looked dangerous to adult eyes. On Sundays, church bells rang from a dozen directions, each congregation calling its own to prayer in its own way. The boy did not attend services. Master Cornelius believed that work was the truest form of worship, and the boy suspected this was mostly an excuse to avoid sitting still for hours. The fears of childhood followed him into apprenticeship, though they changed shape as he grew. He feared the master's disappointment more than his anger. He feared the day his hands might fail him, might develop a tremor or a weakness that would end his craft before it truly began. He feared the diseases that swept through the city most summers, turning streets into corridors of death where people avoided their neighbors' eyes. He feared, though he rarely admitted it even to himself, that he would never be good enough to make a life from this work. But there were joys, too, small and precisely shaped as a well-cut piece of leather. The first time Master Cornelius nodded at his work without criticism. The warm weight of bread in his stomach after a long day. the moment his hands began to move with confidence, when muscle memory replaced conscious thought, the satisfaction of seeing a broken thing made whole again. By his 4th year, he could tooling leather with decorative patterns, pressing designs into dampened surfaces that would hold their shape when dry. This was art, not just craft, and it opened something in him he had not known existed. Here was beauty he could create with his own hands, patterns that pleased the eye and announced to the world that the maker possessed skill worth paying for. Robert completed his apprenticeship and left to work for a saddle maker near the docks. James was dismissed in the boy's 5th year for theft, though the boy suspected the real crime was talking back once too often. New apprentices came and went. The boy, no longer quite a boy, became the senior apprentice, the one who showed newcomers how to hold a knife, where to find the whetstone, which customers to watch carefully. Master Cornelius grew older in those years, his hands developing the stiffness that comes to all craftsmen eventually. He relied more on his senior apprentice, trusted him with tasks that once would have been reserved for the master alone. This trust was its own form of payment, worth more than the coins that would come later. The world beyond the shop grew louder with complaints the apprentice did not fully understand. Men in taverns spoke of taxes and representation, of rights and tyranny. Sometimes these discussions turned to shouting, occasionally to violence. The apprentice listened but did not join in. He had learned James's lesson well. Men in power, whether they wore British red or colonial brown, were to be respected to their faces and avoided when possible. In his final year of apprenticeship, the young man completed his masterwork, a saddle crafted entirely by his own hands, from selecting the hide to the final polishing. He worked on it during hours that belonged to sleep, perfecting details no one might notice, but that he would always know were there. The stitching was invisible, the leather molded to support a rider's weight while remaining supple enough to move with the horse. He tooled a simple pattern along the edges, nothing ostentatious, just enough to show he understood beauty as well as function. Master Cornelius examined it in silence for a long time. Then he placed one hand on the young man's shoulder. "You'll do." 2 words that meant everything. The apprenticeship ended on a morning much like the one it had begun. Except now, the young man stood in the doorway with tools of his own, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. Master Cornelius gave him letters of reference and a small purse of coins, enough to live on for a month, perhaps 2 if he was careful. After that, he would need to find work, prove himself to other masters, build a reputation in a city full of skilled craftsmen who saw him as competition. He walked out into Market Street with uncertainty sitting in his chest like a stone, but his hands were steady, and they knew what they could do. Finding work proved easier than expected, though the work itself was harder. Master Cornelius's letters carried weight in Philadelphia's craftsman circles, and within a week the young journeyman found employment with a saddle maker named Hewitt, who supplied the carriage trade. The shop stood on Chestnut Street, larger than Cornelius's modest establishment, with 3 journeymen and twice as many apprentices working in organized chaos. Hewitt was a different sort of master. Where Cornelius had been spare with words and careful with praise, Hewitt talked constantly, filling the workshop with commentary on politics, prices, and the questionable virtue of his competitors. He paid well, but expected perfection. A single crooked stitch could earn a lecture that lasted longer than the time needed to fix the error. The journeyman learned to check his work twice, then once more before presenting it. The other journeymen were cordial but distant. They had their own concerns, their own paths to master status, and saw little benefit in befriending someone who might one day compete for the same commissions. This suited the young craftsman well enough. He had not come for friendship. He had come to refine his skills and save money toward the dream that occupied his thoughts during the long hours of stitching and tooling. His own shop. The vision was precise in his mind. A place on a decent street, not too grand to intimidate ordinary customers, but respectable enough to attract quality work. 2 apprentices, perhaps 3, a sign above the door with his name, announcing to Philadelphia that here was a master craftsman worthy of trust. The dream required money, more money than he had ever possessed, and so he lived as if poverty were a choice he made daily, rather than a condition imposed upon him. He rented a corner of a room in a boarding house near the waterfront, sharing the space with a rope maker who snored like a wounded animal. His meals were bread, cheese, and whatever vegetables were cheapest at market. He owned 2 shirts and rotated them carefully, washing one while wearing the other. Every spare coin went into a leather pouch he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The pouch grew heavier with agonizing slowness. The city continued its arguments with itself and with distant London. News arrived by ship, always weeks old, telling of acts and taxes that made men pound tables in taverns. The Stamp Act came and went amid protests the journeyman witnessed from careful distances. He saw angry crowds, heard speeches about liberty and rights, watched as stamp distributors were burned in effigy. The passion mystified him slightly. These were matters for merchants and gentlemen, for men who owned property and had something to lose beyond their labor. His own concerns were more immediate. A commission for 6-carriage harnesses that had to be completed in 4 days. A wealthy patron who changed his mind about decorative patterns after the work was half finished. The moment when Hewitt, examining a particularly complex piece of tooling, grunted approval and added an extra shilling to the week's wages. These were the victories that mattered. In his 2nd year as a journeyman, he began spending Sunday evenings at a tavern called The Compass, not for the ale, which was indifferent, but for the company. A group of craftsmen gathered there weekly, young men like himself who had completed apprenticeships and were navigating the uncertain waters between journeyman and master. They shared information about which masters were hiring, which patrons paid promptly, which materials merchants could be trusted not to pass off inferior goods as quality. It was at the Compass that he first noticed Sarah. She was the tavern keeper's daughter, moving between tables with practiced efficiency, carrying trays that would have bowed the arms of men less accustomed to the work. She had dark hair pinned up in a style that suggested practicality rather than fashion, and a way of listening to customers that made them feel heard without encouraging the kind of familiarity that led to trouble. The journeyman watched her navigate the room's various personalities with something approaching admiration. Their first conversation was brief and transactional. He ordered food, she brought it, he paid. But she smiled when she set down the plate, and the smile suggested she had noticed him noticing her. "You're the leather worker," she said the next week. "The one who doesn't drink much, but stays late anyway." "The ale isn't worth drinking much of," he replied, surprised by his own boldness. "My father would agree with you, though he'd never admit it to customers." After that, they spoke more easily. She would pause at his table when the crowd thinned, asking about his work with what seemed like genuine interest. He found himself describing the difference between vegetable-tanned and oil-tanned leather, with an enthusiasm that would have embarrassed him had she not appeared genuinely curious. She told him about managing the tavern's accounts, about the sailors who tried to leave without paying, about her mother, who had died 3 years past and left a hole in the household that had not yet been filled. The courtship, if it could be called that, proceeded with the caution of two people who understood that hope was a luxury requiring careful management. He could not offer her much. A journeyman's wages, a rented corner of a room, a future that remained stubbornly theoretical. Her father, when he looked at the young craftsman at all, saw a man without property or prospects, someone beneath his daughter's station, however modest that station might be. But she met him on Sunday afternoons, when weather permitted, walking along the Delaware where ships from distant ports unloaded goods that spoke of worlds beyond Philadelphia. They talked about small things and large ones, about the life she wanted and the one he was trying to build. He told her about the shop he would own one day, described it in such detail that she laughed and asked if he had already drawn the plans. "In my head," he admitted, "every night before sleep." "And is there room in these plans for anything besides leather and tools?" The question hung between them, full of implications he was not quite ready to examine. Seasons turned. He worked for Hewitt, then for a harness maker named Stokes, whose specialty was military equipment. The British garrison in the city needed constant supplies, and Stokes had contracts that kept his workshop busy from dawn until dark. The journeyman learned to work faster without sacrificing quality, developed an eye for the kind of durability that military life required. A soldier's harness could not fail in the field. Lives depended on stitches holding, on leather not cracking under strain. He also learned to keep his thoughts hidden when officers came to inspect the work. They spoke to Stokes, but looked through the journeyman as if they were furniture, useful but beneath notice. One captain complained about a price, suggesting that colonial craftsmen were gouging His Majesty's army. Stokes, who needed the contracts, apologized and reduced his fee. The journeyman absorbed the loss in reduced wages that week. "Bastards," muttered one of the other workers after the officers left. The journeyman said nothing, but the sentiment found fertile ground. His pouch of coins grew heavier, though never as quickly as he wished. He calculated constantly, figuring how many more months of work, how many more saved shillings, before he could afford to rent a shop and purchase the basic equipment a master craftsman required. 2 years, perhaps 3. The number felt both impossibly distant and tantalizingly close. Sarah's father warmed to him slightly when he learned the young man had plans beyond remaining a hired craftsman forever. Not warm enough to offer blessing, but enough to stop glaring quite so fiercely when they spoke in the tavern. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. In his 5th year as a journeyman, an opportunity arrived in the form of old Willem, a Dutch harness maker who had worked the same stall in the market for 3 decades. Willem's hands had developed the tremor that ended all craftsmen's careers eventually, and he was looking to sell his operation to someone who would maintain his reputation. The price was reasonable, almost suspiciously so, until the journeyman examined the stall and equipment more carefully. The tools were worn but serviceable. The location was decent, visible to foot traffic, but not so prominent as to command premium rent. It was not the shop he had envisioned in his detailed dreams, but it was real, available, and within reach if he stretched his savings to their limit. He negotiated carefully, using every lesson learned from watching masters deal with customers. Willem came down slightly in price. They shook hands on a Tuesday afternoon, and suddenly the journeyman was no longer a journeyman. He was a master craftsman with his own business, his own tools, and a debt of worry that sat heavy in his chest. Sarah kissed him when he told her, there on the street, in view of anyone who cared to look. "Now you're someone," she said. He was not certain that was true, but he appreciated her faith more than he could express. The first months were terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Customers who had trusted Willem needed convincing that the new proprietor could maintain the same standards. He worked longer hours than he ever had as a journeyman, taking on repairs that barely covered costs just to keep hands busy and build reputation. Slowly, gradually, the work increased. A merchant whose bridle he repaired came back for a full harness. A neighbor recommended him to a friend. Word spread in the quiet way that mattered most among those who valued craft over flash. By summer's end, he could afford to eat something besides bread and cheese. By autumn, he hired his first apprentice, a boy who reminded him uncomfortably of his younger self, all hunger and hope and clumsy hands. By winter, he had saved enough to approach Sarah's father with a proposal that was both question and business arrangement. The wedding was small, practical, an exchange of promises witnessed by friends from the compass and a few of Sarah's relations. No grand celebration, but it felt sufficient. They moved into rooms above a printer's shop, 2 rooms with a fireplace and windows that faced east to catch morning light. She continued helping her father at the tavern several evenings a week. He worked at the stall from dawn until dusk fell. They built a life from these small pieces, fitting them together like a well-made harness, each part supporting the others. On clear evenings, they would walk through the city they were both bound to, watching it grow and argue with itself, becoming something neither of them quite recognized. The streets felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure, though neither could have articulated exactly what they sensed in the air. He still dreamed of a better shop, a proper establishment with a sign and a door that locked. But lying beside Sarah in the dark, listening to the city settle into night sounds, he found himself thinking that perhaps he had already acquired something more valuable than any shop could provide. The thought brought contentment, but also a whisper of unease he could not quite explain. The shop came to him in his 32nd year, not through careful planning, but through the kind of luck that arrives wearing the clothes of tragedy. Old Martin, who owned a proper storefront on 2nd Street, died of a fever that swept through the city that spring. His widow, overwhelmed by debts and lacking knowledge of the trade, sold the lease and equipment for less than their worth. The harness maker, now husband and father to a daughter barely 2 years old, recognized opportunity when it appeared. The new shop was everything the market stall had not been: brick walls instead of canvas, a door with a proper lock, windows that could be shuttered against weather, room enough for 2 workbenches, and storage that did not require constant protection from rain. He moved his tools on a September morning, carrying them with the reverence some men reserved for religious objects. Sarah stood in the doorway, their daughter balanced on her hip, and smiled at his visible pride. "You've earned this," she said simply. He had, though the earning had taken years he could feel in his shoulders and his hands. The sign above the door announced his trade without his name. That would come later, when reputation made a name worth displaying. Philadelphia continued its transformation into something restless and angry. The Townsend Acts brought new tensions, new boycotts, new rhetoric about liberty that seemed to matter more to merchants than to craftsmen who simply wanted steady work. He avoided political discussions when possible, nodded politely when they were unavoidable, and focused on the leather that represented his family's survival. His clientele grew more varied as his reputation spread. Farmers from across the Delaware who needed working harnesses built to withstand hard use. Merchants who wanted decorative saddles that announced their status. Ship captains who required specialized equipment for cargo handling. And, increasingly, gentlemen from the better parts of the city who seemed to have endless needs for leather goods and money to match. One such gentleman was Mr. Ashford. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October, carried by a carriage that announced wealth before its owner descended. Ashford was perhaps 50, well-dressed in a way that spoke of London tailors, with the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. He carried a saddle, an expensive piece showing significant wear, and placed it on the workbench with the careful handling of someone who understood quality. "I'm told you're skilled with repairs that maintain original character," Ashford said. His voice carried the accent of education and privilege. "I do my best to honor the maker's intent, sir." "Excellent. This saddle has sentimental value. I'd like it restored, not replaced." The harness maker examined the piece carefully. English work, probably 20 years old, made by a master who understood that a saddle was more than simple function. The leather had dried in places, some stitching had loosened, and the tree beneath showed stress points that would need reinforcing. Significant work, but well within his capabilities. They agreed on price and timeline. Ashford departed in his carriage, leaving the saddle and a deposit that represented more money than the craftsman typically saw in a month. The work began routinely enough. He disassembled the saddle with care, laying out each piece in order so reassembly would follow the original pattern. The leather panels came away to reveal the wooden tree beneath, and here the maker's skill became fully apparent. The tree had been shaped to distribute a rider's weight while allowing the horse's spine freedom of movement. Quality work from an era when such things mattered more than speed of production. He was examining the cantle, running his fingers along its curve to assess stress points, when he noticed something odd, a slight unevenness in what should have been smooth wood. Closer inspection revealed a seam so perfectly fitted that it was nearly invisible. His curiosity, that dangerous quality that Sarah often warned him about, demanded investigation. The compartment opened with gentle pressure in precisely the right spot. Inside, folded into a space barely larger than a playing card, were papers covered in writing that made no immediate sense. Letters and numbers arranged in patterns that suggested meaning without revealing it. Codes, obviously, though for what purpose he could not guess. His first instinct was to close the compartment and forget what he had seen. Curiosity satisfied, lesson learned, return to work and avoid trouble. But his hands, acting with a mind separate from his better judgment, unfolded the papers and studied them more carefully. The writing was recent, the paper crisp. Whatever these messages said, they had been placed here recently, and presumably would be retrieved by someone who knew where to look. He replaced the papers exactly as he had found them, closed the compartment, and sat staring at the disassembled saddle for a long time. His mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Smuggling information, business secrets, political conspiracy. The last seemed most likely, given the mood of the city. But conspiracy toward what end? And involving whom? Sarah noticed his distraction that evening. He claimed fatigue, which was not entirely false, and avoided her knowing looks. That night, lying awake while she slept beside him, he weighed his options. Report the discovery to authorities? But which authorities? And what if he chose wrong? Confront Ashford directly? That seemed foolish and potentially dangerous. Simply complete the repair and pretend ignorance. This last option appealed most strongly but sat uneasily in his conscience. By morning, he had decided on a middle course. He would repair the saddle without disturbing the compartment, return it to Ashford, and observe the man's reaction carefully. If Ashford seemed satisfied and departed without incident, the matter could be forgotten. If something seemed amiss, he would reconsider his position. The repair took 3 days of careful work. He restored the leather to suppleness, replaced worn stitching with thread that matched the original, and reinforced the tree's stress points with techniques that would have made Master Cornelius nod approval. The hidden compartment he left untouched, though he checked twice to ensure the papers remained exactly as he had found them. Ashford returned as scheduled, examined the saddle with evident pleasure, and paid the balance without haggling. But as he prepared to leave, he paused and turned back. "You do excellent work. I may have additional commissions for you in the coming months. Saddles requiring, shall we say, particular attention to detail and discretion." The words were casual, but the look in Ashford's eyes was not. He knows, the craftsman thought, or suspects, or is testing. "I'm always pleased to serve patrons who appreciate quality work, sir." After Ashford departed, the harness-maker stood in his shop, feeling as though the floor had shifted beneath him. He had stumbled into something, though he was not yet certain what. The discovery should have ended with the saddle's return, but Ashford's parting words suggested it was only beginning. Thomas, a fellow craftsman who had become his closest friend since the days at the Compass, stopped by that evening. They shared ale while the craftsman's apprentice swept the shop, and in the careful way of men who trust each other, the conversation turned to matters weightier than leather. "You look troubled, my friend." "A patron, wealthy, connected. I think he may be involved in activities that could bring attention I don't want." Thomas, who was older and had seen more of the world's complications, chose his words carefully. "The city is full of men playing dangerous games right now. Patriots, loyalists, smugglers using politics as cover for profit. A wise craftsman takes commissions, does good work, and asks no questions that don't concern his trade. And if the questions find you anyway, then you remember that you have a wife and child whose safety depends on your good judgment." The advice was sound, practical, exactly what the harness-maker himself would have offered someone else, but it did not ease the knot in his chest. Over the following weeks, Ashford returned with more commissions, always saddles, always expensive pieces requiring repair or modification. The craftsman examined each with meticulous care and found hidden compartments in 3 more, sometimes empty, sometimes containing the same sort of coded papers. He never disturbed them, never acknowledged their existence, and completed each job with the skill that was earning him reputation throughout Philadelphia. But he also began noticing patterns. Ashford's visits followed a schedule, arriving every second Tuesday with remarkable consistency. Other gentlemen began appearing with similar requests, always mentioning Ashford's recommendation, always emphasizing discretion. The commissions paid well, better than the craftsman's other work, and the money was difficult to refuse, with a growing family and a shop that still carried debt. Sarah noticed the additional income and asked no questions, trusting his judgment as she always had. But she also noticed his distraction, the way he startled at unexpected sounds, how he had begun locking the shop's door even during business hours. "Whatever you're involved in," she said one night, "remember that cleverness is no match for power. Men like us survive by being overlooked. I'm not involved in anything. I'm a harness maker, doing commissioned work." She looked at him with an expression that suggested she knew he was lying, understood why he was lying, and loved him despite it. The look carried more weight than any argument. Winter approached, bringing cold that crept through the shop's walls and made leather stiff and difficult to work. The craftsman kept his fires burning and his hands busy, crafting harnesses and saddles that carried secrets he pretended not to know. He had become, without choosing it, a link in a chain whose length and purpose remained hidden. On a December evening, as he was closing the shop, a man he did not recognize appeared in the doorway. Not a gentleman like Ashford, but someone harder, with eyes that assessed threats before noticing anything else. "We should talk," the man said quietly, "about the work you've been doing and what it means." The harness maker's hand moved instinctively toward the awl on his workbench, though what he thought he could do with it against real danger he could not have said. The man noticed the gesture and smiled without humor. "I'm not here to threaten you. Quite the opposite. But you've stumbled into matters that require discussion, and ignoring them won't make them disappear. My name is Webb, and I represent people who value both your skills and your continued health." The floor had shifted again, and this time the craftsman knew there would be no returning to the simple life of leather and stitching. Whatever he had stumbled into had recognized him, and recognition, he was learning, carried costs he had not yet calculated. Webb settled into the shop's single spare chair with the ease of a man accustomed to uncomfortable conversations. The harness maker remained standing, his hand no longer reaching for the awl, but not entirely relaxed either. Outside, 2nd Street had grown quiet with evening, lamplight making small circles against the November darkness. "You're wondering why I'm here instead of someone more official," Webb began. "The answer is simple. Official attention would destroy you, and that serves no one's interests. I'm a craftsman. I repair saddles, nothing more." Webb's expression suggested he appreciated the attempt but found it unnecessary. "You repair saddles that carry messages between people who prefer their communications remain invisible. You've been doing so for 2 months now, and you've done it well. No curiosity shown, no questions asked, no compartments disturbed. This restraint has been noted and valued." The harness maker felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had believed his discretion was protection. Instead, it had been observation. "What you've stumbled into," Webb continued, "is a network of people working to resist British overreach, not through riots or violence, but through information. Names, troop movements, supply routes, plans. Knowledge that helps those who oppose tyranny to act wisely rather than rashly. And you're telling me this because you trust me?" "I'm telling you this because you're already involved, whether you intended to be or not. The question now is whether you choose to be involved with understanding and purpose, or continue as an unwitting tool who might make mistakes that endanger everyone, yourself included." The logic was inescapable and infuriating. The harness maker had spent years building a life based on skill and steady work, avoiding precisely this kind of entanglement. Now a stranger sat in his shop, explaining that those careful years had led him here anyway. "What if I refuse? What if I tell the next patron I can't take their commission?" Webb leaned forward slightly. "Then someone will wonder why you've suddenly developed scruples about wealthy customers. Questions will be asked. Investigations might follow. Your shop, your wife, your child, all examined by people who see conspiracy everywhere and have the power to destroy lives on suspicion alone. Is that what you want?" It was not a threat, precisely. More an explanation of consequences that already existed, independent of Webb's presence or preferences. The harness maker recognized the difference and found no comfort in it. "What do you want from me?" "Continue as you have been. Repair saddles, install compartments when requested, ask no questions. But also understand what you're part of, so you can recognize danger if it approaches. And occasionally, when necessary, craft compartments to our specifications rather than simply maintaining existing ones." "So I become a spy?" "You become a craftsman who serves the cause of liberty with his skills, same as a blacksmith who makes weapons, or a printer who produces pamphlets. Your contribution is less visible, but no less valuable." The harness maker thought of Sarah waiting at home with their daughter. He thought of the shop he had worked years to establish. He thought of Master Cornelius teaching him that leather could only be shaped according to its nature, not forced against it. Perhaps men were the same, bent by circumstances toward shapes they never intended to assume. "I need to think about this." Webb stood, his movement suggesting the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "Think quickly. Ashford will return next Tuesday with another commission. Handle it as you have the others. But understand now what you're handling, and remember, the British hang spies. But they also hang those who know about spies and fail to report them. There is no neutral ground in what's coming." After Webb departed, the harness maker sat in his empty shop, surrounded by tools and leather and the smell of honest work, and felt the world he had built become something less solid. He locked the door carefully, checked it twice, and walked home through streets that seemed darker than usual. Sarah knew immediately that something had shifted. She served him supper and waited, her patience one of the qualities he valued most about her. Finally, after their daughter had been put to bed, he told her an edited version of the truth. A patron involved in activities that might be dangerous. A choice between involvement and exposure. No good options, only varying degrees of risk. She listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing until he finished. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "We've survived poverty and disease and uncertainty. We'll survive this, too. But promise me, you'll never risk everything for principles that belong to men richer than us. Whatever you do it to protect our family first." Her pragmatism was absolute and oddly comforting. She was right, of course. The men playing these games had estates to retreat to, connections to protect them, resources to flee if danger approached. Craftsmen had only their skills and their caution. Ashford returned the following Tuesday, precisely as Webb had predicted. He brought a saddle requiring modification, describing in careful detail where reinforcement was needed and how the weight distribution should change. The specifications, the harness maker now understood, were instructions for compartment placement. He nodded, quoted a price, and accepted the commission. The work required 2 full days. He built the compartments into the saddle's structure so seamlessly that only someone who knew exactly where to look could find them. The craftsmanship satisfied his professional pride, even as it troubled his conscience. He was, he realized, exceptionally good at this particular skill, better perhaps than he wanted to be. Winter deepened. Snow fell on Philadelphia, turning its geometric streets into white corridors where footprints told stories to anyone patient enough to read them. The harness maker learned to be aware of who came and went from his shop, who lingered too long across the street, which customers might be something other than they appeared. The awareness was exhausting. Thomas noticed his friend's tension during one of their evening conversations. "You look like a man waiting for something bad to happen." "These are bad times for everyone. I'm no different." "You're lying, but I won't press. Just remember that surviving bad times requires knowing when to bend and when to break. Most men get the timing wrong." The harness maker absorbed this wisdom, along with all the other lessons accumulating like weight on his shoulders. Trust no one completely. Question everything. Keep secrets, even from those you love. These were not the lessons he had learned from Master Cornelius, but they were the ones his current life demanded. Webb returned occasionally, always an evening, always with information about upcoming commissions or warnings about increased British attention. The conversations were brief, professional, as if they were merely merchant and supplier, rather than conspirators in activities that could lead to the gallows. The harness maker appreciated Webb's efficiency while resenting his presence. Spring arrived with the kind of warmth that makes people forget winter's harshness. The shop's business expanded as farmers prepared for planting season and required harnesses repaired or replaced. Legitimate work mixed with the secret commissions until the harness makers sometimes forgot which was which. The forgetting troubled him more than the remembering. One April morning, a British officer appeared at the shop. Captain Thornton, trim in his red coat, carrying himself with the casual authority of empire. He had a bridle that needed repair, he explained, and had heard this particular craftsman did excellent work. The harness maker examined the bridle with hands that remained steady through force of will. Routine work. Nothing suspicious about the request. But Thornton watched him with eyes that assessed more than leather quality. "You serve many of the city's better families, I understand," Thornton said casually. I'm fortunate to have patrons who appreciate skilled work, sir. Mr. Ashford, for instance. Fine gentleman. Excellent taste in horseflesh and equipment. The name dropped into conversation like a stone into water, spreading ripples the harness-maker hoped did not show on his face. Mr. Ashford has been kind enough to recommend my services to others, yes. Generous of him. Strange man, though. Travels frequently, always buying and selling things. One wonders what exactly he trades in. The harness maker kept his focus on the bridle, examining stitching that needed no such attention. I wouldn't know, sir. I only concern myself with leatherwork. Thornton smiled without warmth. Of course, a wise policy limiting one's concerns to one's trade. Curiosity can be dangerous in unsettled times. After the captain departed, the harness maker sent word to Webb through the method they had established. A note left with a specific merchant who asked no questions. The response came quickly. Thornton was known to them, clever and ambitious, someone who would use suspicion as a tool even without proof. Increased caution was required. The increased caution made everything harder. Each commission now carried double weight, the practical challenge of good craftsmanship and the additional burden of avoiding detection. The harness maker found himself checking and rechecking his work, searching for any detail that might betray the compartment's presence to skilled inspection. Sarah noticed his nightmares, the way he woke suddenly in darkness as if expecting discovery. She said nothing, but held him until the trembling stopped, her presence the only certainty in a world becoming less solid. In May, one of Webb's other craftsmen was arrested, a silversmith who had been carrying messages in modified tea services. The man was questioned, held for 3 days, then released without charges, but with a warning that destroyed his business. Customers avoided his shop as if conspiracy were contagious. Within a month, he had fled the city. Destination unknown. The harness maker understood the message. The network was known, at least partially. The British were watching, waiting for clear evidence before moving decisively. Everyone involved was walking on ice that might crack at any moment. We need to be more careful, he told Webb during their next meeting. We need to be more committed, Webb countered. Careful men accomplish nothing. Sometimes risk is the only rational choice. They argued, though quietly, about philosophy and pragmatism, about what mattered more in times that tested every certainty. Neither convinced the other, but both understood they were bound together now by decisions already made, paths already chosen. Summer brought heat that made the shop's interior stifling and leatherwork difficult. The harness maker kept his door open for air and watched 2nd Street's parade of humanity with eyes that had learned to see patterns in randomness. He recognized watchers now, could spot the casual observer who paid too much attention to his customers. One evening in late June, as he was closing the shop, he found a small mark carved into his doorframe. A symbol Webb had shown him months ago, meaning danger and caution in equal measure. Someone had been there, noticed something, left this warning. He locked up quickly and took a different route home, watching his back trail with the paranoia that had become his constant companion. Sarah met him at the door, their daughter playing nearby, and he wondered how long he could sustain this divided life before something shattered. The answer he suspected would arrive sooner than he wished, and in a form he would not recognize until too late. The British arrived in September, with the kind of organized efficiency that transforms a city overnight. 10,000 soldiers, or so people whispered, though numbers varied with each telling. What remained constant was the sound of boots on cobblestones, the sharp commands in accents that marked authority, and the understanding that Philadelphia now belonged to someone else. The harness maker watched from his shop doorway as columns of redcoats marched past, their uniforms somehow remaining pristine, despite the dust and distance they had traveled. Civilians pressed against buildings, watching with expressions ranging from sullen resentment to careful neutrality. No one cheered. That silence carried its own message. Webb had disappeared 3 days before the occupation, leaving only a brief warning delivered by a nervous boy who would not meet the craftsman's eyes. He said to continue as normal. They'll need your services more than ever now. Normal had become a word without meaning. The shop's business changed immediately. British officers needed equipment maintained, replaced, modified to their specifications. They arrived with requisition orders that were really commands, dressed in polite language, offering payment that was theoretically fair, but carried the weight of refusal being impossible. The harness maker accepted each commission with the deference expected of occupied citizens, his face revealing nothing of the calculation happening behind his eyes. Captain Thornton became a regular presence, always polite, always watching. He brought legitimate work and paid promptly, but his visits felt like inspections disguised as commerce. The captain would examine finished pieces with appreciation, comment on the quality of stitching, and occasionally mention other officers who might require similar services. Each conversation carried undercurrents the harness maker strained to interpret. "You've done well for yourself," Thornton observed during one visit, his gaze sweeping the shop's interior. "A proper establishment. Wife and child, I understand? Stability is valuable in uncertain times." "I'm grateful for the work, sir." "As you should be. Some craftsmen have found their patriot sympathies interfere with business judgment. Unfortunate for them and their families." The threat was clear, even wrapped in pleasantry. Cooperate or lose everything. The harness maker nodded understanding and kept his hands steady on the leather he was working. But the British commissions were not his only work. Messages still needed carrying, perhaps more desperately now than before. Patriots who had not fled the city required communication with those outside British lines. The network Webb had built continued operating, though with increased caution and dwindling participants. Some had been arrested. Others had simply stopped responding to contacts, retreating into survival's silent safety. The harness maker found himself crafting compartments into British saddles, hiding rebel messages in equipment that would be carried past checkpoints by the very soldiers meant to prevent such communications. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes were not measured in lives. Winter arrived early and hard, bringing cold that made the occupation's hardships more acute. Food grew scarce as British quartermasters claimed supplies, paying with promissory notes that might never be redeemed. Coal and firewood disappeared into military stores. Civilians huddled in inadequately heated rooms, burning what they could scavenge and trying not to think about the months ahead. The shop became one of the few warm places on 2nd Street, its forge and lamps creating an island of heat that attracted customers like moths. The harness maker kept his fires burning longer than economical, understanding that hospitality was its own form of resistance. People came to warm themselves, stayed to talk, shared information in fragments that he assembled into understanding of the city's hidden life. Sarah's father's tavern, the Compass, had become a gathering place for British officers seeking entertainment and warmth. Sarah helped there most evenings now, the additional income necessary as civilian economy contracted. She came home late, exhausted, and shared what she had overheard with the careful precision of someone who understood information's value. Captain Thornton was asking about Ashford again, wondering when he would return to the city. "What did you say?" "That I knew nothing of gentleman's business. The same thing I say to everyone who asks about anything." She was learning the same lessons he had, the necessity of useful ignorance, how to be present while remaining invisible. The education aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. Their daughter, now 4, had adapted to occupation with a child's resilience. She played quietly, understood not to approach the soldiers who sometimes patrolled past their windows, and asked fewer questions than children her age typically demanded. The harness maker watched her learning caution and felt something break inside him that he could not name. In January, word arrived through channels so indirect the harness maker never learned its source. Ashford was returning to Philadelphia, traveling under British protection, with goods to sell and business to conduct. The message included warning. Ashford was suspected, but not yet proven guilty of anything. He had cultivated relationships with British officers, played the role of loyal merchant, and was using this access to continue his work. His return would draw attention to everyone he contacted. The harness maker understood he would need to be extraordinarily careful. Ashford appeared at the shop on a February morning when snow fell in fat flakes that muffled sound and reduced visibility. He entered, stamping his boots, bringing cold air and an energy that suggested confidence despite circumstances. The two men regarded each other with the complicated awareness of people bound by secrets neither could safely acknowledge. "I have work for you," Ashford said without preamble. "Several saddles requiring your particular expertise." "I would be honored to serve you, sir, though my schedule has become quite full with military commissions. I'm sure you can find time for an old patron, especially as Captain Thornton himself recommended I engage your services." The information landed like a stone. Thornton had directed Ashford here, which meant one of several possibilities, none comforting. Either Thornton suspected nothing and was genuinely recommending quality work, or he suspected everything and was setting a trap. Or, most complicated of all, Thornton was part of the network himself, and this was communication disguised as commerce. The harness maker took the commissions, examined each saddle with professional attention, and quoted prices that were fair but not suspiciously generous. After Ashford departed, he sat alone in his shop trying to untangle the web he was caught in, knowing that one wrong interpretation could destroy everything. The work required days of careful attention. He built compartments into places that would survive inspection unless someone knew precisely where to look and had time to conduct thorough examination. The messages he found waiting in Ashford's original compartments were longer than usual, more detailed, suggesting urgency that matched the occupied city's desperate situation. Captain Thornton arrived unexpectedly while the harness maker was working on the third saddle. The compartment was open, though the message had been carefully hidden in a tool drawer the moment he heard boots on the stairs. Thornton examined the partially completed work with interest that seemed genuine. "Excellent craftsmanship. Ashford chose well in recommending you. I strive to serve all patrons equally well, sir." A diplomatic answer. "Tell me, do you know Ashford well? His business? His associations?" The harness maker kept his hands moving, stitching with steady rhythm. "I know only what any craftsman knows of patrons, sir. He appreciates quality work and pays promptly. Beyond that, gentlemen's affairs are not my concern." Thornton walked around the shop slowly, examining tools, studying the works in progress, creating tension through silence. Finally, he turned back to face the craftsman directly. "Loyalties are complicated in occupied cities. People make choices based on survival rather than principle. I understand this and do not judge harshly those who bend to necessity. But I do judge harshly those who pretend loyalty while harboring treachery. I pretend nothing, sir. I am a harness maker trying to support my family through difficult times. Yes, wife and daughter. Sarah is her name, I believe. She works at the Compass, where many officers spend their evenings. A pleasant woman, discreet." Valuable qualities. The implicit threat was clear. Cooperation in exchange for family safety. The harness maker met Thornton's gaze with the blank expression he had perfected over months of occupation. "I am grateful for any protection my family receives, sir." After Thornton left, the harness maker allowed himself to shake for precisely 1 minute, then returned to work. Fear was a luxury he could not afford, though it lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. Spring brought rumors of American victories in battles far from Philadelphia. Valley Forge, where Washington's army had suffered through winter, apparently had not broken, as the British expected. The rumors energized citizens and worried occupiers in equal measure. Patrols increased, searches became more thorough. The noose was tightening around anyone suspected of rebel sympathies. The harness maker completed Ashford's commissions and delivered them with the ceremonial politeness their transaction required. Ashford examined each piece, nodded satisfaction, and paid in British currency that spent easily but felt contaminated somehow. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Difficult times require difficult choices. You've made yours with admirable skill. Whatever comes next, remember that you acted with honor, constrained by necessity. That matters." The words felt like absolution, or farewell, or warning. Perhaps all three. In May, word spread through the city's hidden channels. The British were preparing to evacuate Philadelphia, returning to New York to consolidate forces. The occupation would end, not through military defeat, but strategic calculation. Relief mixed with anxiety about what would follow. Would the patriots who had fled return, seeking vengeance against those who had accommodated occupation? Would there be trials, punishments, a reckoning that spared no one who had survived through compromise? The harness maker worked through these uncertain days with the focus that had sustained him through every crisis. Leather and tools, and the satisfaction of good work done properly. These certainties endured when everything else became negotiable. The British withdrew in June. a long column of soldiers and loyalist civilians marching away from a city that had tolerated their presence without embracing it. The harness maker watched from his doorway, feeling nothing that resembled triumph. He had survived occupation the way he survived everything, through caution and skill, and the ability to become invisible when necessary. But survival, he was learning, left its own kind of scars, visible only to those who had paid its price. Philadelphia, after occupation, felt like a room someone had rearranged in darkness. Everything stood in approximately the same place, yet nothing felt quite right. The harness maker walked streets that seemed both familiar and strange, noticing gaps where businesses had closed, new faces where old ones had disappeared, and an atmosphere of suspicion that clung to conversations like morning fog. Webb reappeared in July, thinner than when he had vanished before the British arrival, his clothes showing the kind of wear that spoke of hard travel and harder living. He came to the shop at dusk, glancing over his shoulder with the reflexive caution of someone who had survived by never fully trusting safety. "You made it through," Webb said, settling into the same chair he had occupied during their first meeting a lifetime ago. "I kept my head down and my work steady. More than that, you kept the network functioning when most had fled or been compromised. The messages you carried through British lines provided intelligence that mattered. Troop movements, supply routes, strategic plans. You should know that your work contributed to victories you'll never hear about." The harness maker continued oiling a bridle, keeping his hands occupied while his mind processed Webb's words. He had known his work mattered, in an abstract sense, but hearing it stated plainly brought no satisfaction. Only a tired awareness that he had been useful in ways that might have gotten him killed. "Captain Thornton suspected," he said quietly. "He never proved anything, but he knew something was wrong. Thornton was smarter than most. He's gone back to New York with the others, probably writing reports about colonial craftsmen and their potential duplicity. Be grateful he lacked the time or evidence to act on his suspicions." Webb explained that the network had been larger than the harness maker realized, involving dozens of people across multiple trades, each carrying fragments of information that accumulated into actionable intelligence. Some had been discovered and hanged. Others had disappeared in ways that left only questions. Still others, like himself, had simply endured through competence and luck, in measures impossible to separate. "And now?" the harness maker asked. "Now comes the complicated part. Patriots are returning to the city, asking who collaborated and who resisted. They see occupation in simple terms: traitors and heroes, with no room for the gray spaces where most people actually lived." The harness maker understood immediately. His work for British officers, however necessary for maintaining cover, would look like collaboration to those who judged from safety's distance. The fact that he had simultaneously served the Patriot cause would be difficult to prove and dangerous to claim without exposing the network's remaining participants. "What do you suggest?" "Continue as you have been. You're a craftsman who served all customers without political preference. If questioned, show confusion rather than defensiveness. Most importantly, never mention the network unless absolutely necessary. The people who mattered know what you did. The rest don't need to know." After Webb departed, the harness maker sat alone in his shop, feeling the weight of being known by some and invisible to others. The duality that had sustained him through occupation now threatened to trap him in permanent ambiguity, belonging fully to neither camp in a city increasingly divided into camps. Business recovered slowly as Philadelphia rebuilt itself. Farmers needed equipment repaired after years of disruption. Merchants required harnesses for expanding trade networks. Continental Army officers, now the city's new authority, commissioned saddles with the same exacting standards as their British predecessors. The harness maker served them all with equal competence, becoming once again what he had always claimed to be, a skilled craftsman without political affiliation. But the past refused to remain buried.
In August, a man appeared at the shop claiming to represent a committee investigating collaboration during the occupation. He carried a ledger containing names and transactions, evidence of who had profited from British custom. The harness maker's name appeared multiple times, alongside records of commissions completed and payments received. "These are serious matters," the man said, with the officious tone of someone given minor authority who intended to exercise it fully. "Those who enrich themselves serving the enemy must be held accountable." "I served customers who paid for honest work, the same as any craftsman does." "That may be your claim, but committees require more than claims. They require evidence of loyalty. Can you provide such evidence?" The harness maker knew he could, that Webb or Ashford or any number of network members would testify to his contributions. But doing so would expose the network and endanger people who had trusted him with their lives. The choice between self-protection and honor was simpler than it should have been. "I can provide evidence only of my work. Quality harnesses and saddles completed for all customers regardless of uniform color. If that is insufficient for your committees, then I accept whatever judgment they render." The investigator left unsatisfied, making notes that suggested the matter would continue. Sarah, who had overheard the exchange from upstairs, came down after he departed. "You should defend yourself properly. Tell them what you really did." "I can't. Too many people would be exposed." "So you'll let them condemn you for loyalty to people who may not return the favor?" He had no answer that would satisfy her, only the certainty that some obligations transcended self-interest. She stared at him with frustration and understanding warring in her expression, then returned upstairs without another word. The crisis resolved itself through unexpected intervention. Ashford, who had returned to Philadelphia with the other patriots, appeared one morning at the shop. He was dressed more plainly than during occupation, his merchant's prosperity muted to match the city's reduced circumstances, but he carried himself with the same confidence. "I understand certain committees have been troubling you." "Nothing I can't manage, sir." "Perhaps, but management becomes easier with assistance. I've spoken to several committee members explaining that your services to various customers were recommended by me personally, and that I vouch completely for your character and loyalty." The harness maker understood what was being offered: protection through association. Ashford's patriot credentials extending to cover those he chose to shelter. It was generous and problematic in equal measure, creating obligation while solving immediate danger. "I'm grateful for your intervention, though I would not want to impose." "You imposed nothing. I'm simply ensuring that competent craftsmen are not harassed by zealots who understand politics better than complexity."
After Ashford left, the investigators' visits stopped. The harness maker heard no more from committees, though he suspected his name remained in ledgers somewhere, marked with notations only time would erase. He had been judged and found sufficiently ambiguous to escape punishment, a victory that felt more like postponement. Thomas stopped by one evening, the first time they had spoken properly since before the occupation. His friend looked older, worn by experiences he did not immediately share. They sat in the shop's dimming light, talking around subjects too difficult for direct address. "You hear about Marcus?" Thomas asked finally. Marcus had been another craftsman in Webb's network, a silversmith whose arrest the harness maker remembered. "What about him?" "He was hanged. Not by the British, by our side."
Someone claimed he was a loyalist informer during occupation. No trial, just rough justice in an alley. Turned out later, the accusation came from a competitor who wanted his shop. The harness maker absorbed this information in silence. The violence he had feared from British discovery had arrived anyway, wearing different uniforms but serving the same purpose. Terror and control wrapped in righteousness. "The war isn't over," Thomas continued. "It's just changed shape. Now we turn on each other, settling scores and calling it justice. Be careful who you trust, my friend. These times make everyone dangerous." That night, lying beside Sarah while their daughter slept in the next room, the harness maker thought about the double agent whose betrayal had nearly destroyed the network during occupation. Webb had told him the man's name and fate, hanged by the British after his duplicity was discovered by both sides. At the time, it had seemed like appropriate justice. Now he wondered if the man had simply been trying to survive impossible circumstances, making calculations that failed through bad luck rather than bad character. Complexity, he was learning, grew more visible the longer one lived with consequences. Autumn brought news of fighting continuing in southern colonies, of British forces occupying Charleston, of a war that seemed to be spreading rather than concluding. Philadelphia had been spared further military action, but the peace was fragile, dependent on strategic decisions made by men in distant capitals who cared nothing for the lives disrupted by their choices. The shop's routine became its own form of healing. Leather work required presence, attention to detail that crowded out anxiety about what might come next. The harness maker trained his apprentice with the patience Master Cornelius had shown him, passing along not just technique, but philosophy. Good work endured beyond politics. Craft outlasted empires. These truths mattered more than temporary victories or defeats. In November, Webb appeared for what would be their final meeting, though neither knew it yet. He looked tired, in a way that transcended physical exhaustion, carrying the weight of knowing too much and being able to share too little. "The network is being dissolved," Webb explained. "The war continues, but the methods are changing. What we built served its purpose. Now, it becomes a liability, a record of activities that could be used against participants by either side, depending on how history judges us. So we simply forget it existed? We remember privately and acknowledge nothing publicly. You go back to being a harness maker who happened to live through interesting times. I become someone else entirely, somewhere else entirely. We survive by becoming ordinary." They shook hands with the formality of soldiers mustering out,
their partnership ending as it had begun, with pragmatic necessity rather than sentiment. After Webb left, the harness maker realized he had never learned the man's real name, if Webb was itself real, or simply another cover. The not knowing seemed appropriate somehow, a final reminder that the network had operated in spaces between identities, where clarity was liability and mystery was protection. December snow arrived, covering the city in white that made everything look cleaner than it was. The harness maker worked through short winter days, his hands steady on leather, his mind settling into a peace built on distance from danger. He had survived occupation and its aftermath, had contributed to something larger than himself while protecting his family and craft. The cost of that survival remained difficult to calculate, paid in sleepless nights and compromised principles, and the knowledge that he had been many things to many people, truthful to none completely. But perhaps that was simply what survival required in times when truth itself became weaponized. He was a harness maker. Everything else was history. And history, he was learning, belonged to those who wrote it down afterward, not to those who lived it in the confused present. Spring arrived in its third year since the occupation with warmth that felt like permission to stop looking over one's shoulder. The war continued somewhere else, battles fought by younger men, in places the harness maker knew only as names in newspapers. Philadelphia settled into an exhausted normalcy, its citizens too worn by upheaval to sustain the anger that had burned so brightly in earlier years. The shop prospered in modest fashion. Regular customers returned, bringing harnesses worn by hard use and trusting him to restore them properly. New patrons arrived through recommendations, the slow accumulation of reputation that meant more than any advertisement. The harness maker took pride in this organic growth, evidence that skill recognized skill, regardless of politics. His daughter had grown into a clever child who helped in the shop after her lessons, learning to sort tools and identify different leather grades. She had her mother's practical intelligence and something of her father's patience with detail. Watching her work brought him a satisfaction he had not anticipated, the sense that something beyond mere survival might be passed forward. Sarah had aged in the particular way of people who had endured much while complaining little. The lines around her eyes spoke of worry carried privately, burdens shouldered without acknowledgement of their weight. But she smiled more readily now, laughed at their daughter's observations, and seemed to have made peace with the man her husband had become through necessity. They did not speak of the occupation years often, an unspoken agreement to let certain memories settle into a past that grew more distant with each passing season. In May, a letter arrived by courier, addressed in handwriting the harness maker did not immediately recognize. The paper was expensive, the seal official-looking, suggesting correspondence from someone who had climbed to positions where such things mattered. He opened it carefully, aware that letters could still carry danger even in supposedly peaceful times. The message was brief and unsigned, though its source became clear through context. Webb, or whoever Webb had been, writing from wherever his new life had taken him. The note explained that he was dying, consumption most likely, and had certain matters to address before the end. Among them was information the harness maker deserved to know, regarding the work they had done together and its ultimate purpose. A second, smaller envelope had been included,
to be opened only after receiving additional instructions.
The harness maker was to wait for a visitor who would arrive within the fortnight, someone carrying a specific token of identification. Until then, he was to keep the sealed envelope safe and speak of it to no one. The instructions were vintage web, careful and specific, even approaching death. The harness maker tucked both envelopes into his strongbox and tried to return to normal work, though his mind kept circling back to questions about what information could matter years after the network's dissolution. The visitor arrived on a Tuesday morning, a woman of perhaps 40 years, who entered the shop with the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating male spaces. She wore mourning dress, though not the elaborate costume of wealthy grief, and carried herself with a dignity that suggested education despite modest circumstances. "You don't know me," she began without preamble, "but you knew my husband, Thomas Wellingford. He was hanged 4 years ago in New York for espionage." The harness maker felt something cold settle in his chest. He gestured for her to sit, closed the shop's door, and waited for her to continue. She produced a small leather token, a distinctive piece of tooling he recognized immediately. It had been part of a bridle he had crafted years ago, early in his work for the network. Seeing it again brought back memories he had carefully filed away. "My husband's execution was reported as a loyalist caught spying for the British," she continued. "In truth, he was working for the Patriot cause, gathering intelligence from New York while pretending loyalty to the Crown. When he was caught, both sides denied him. The British hanged him as a spy. Our side let him be remembered as a traitor." "I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't understand why you've come to me." "Because you were part of the network that used his intelligence."
The messages you carried through Philadelphia, hidden in your leatherwork, included information he risked everything to obtain. I wanted you to know that his death served a purpose, even though history will never acknowledge it. The harness maker absorbed this, understanding slowly dawning. The network had been larger and more complex than he had realized, with tendrils reaching into occupied cities and British strongholds, people like this woman's husband living doubled lives that ended in unmarked graves and condemned memories. She stood to leave, but paused at the door. "The other envelope, from Webb. He wanted you to have the full accounting, names, dates, operations. Everything the network accomplished. He kept records despite the danger because he believed someone should know the truth, even if it could never be publicly told." After she departed, the harness maker opened the second envelope with hands that had learned steadiness through years of precise work. Inside was a document written in Webb's meticulous hand, page after page, detailing operations, participants, and outcomes. Intelligence that had prevented ambushes, supply routes that had been disrupted, strategic decisions that had been influenced by information gathered at enormous risk. His own contributions appeared throughout, noted with the same dry precision as everything else. Saddles modified to carry messages past British checkpoints. Compartments crafted to hide documents in equipment inspected routinely by officers who never suspected. The list was longer than he remembered, the impact greater than he had understood at the time. But what struck him most were the names of others in the network, people he had never known were involved. Thomas, his friend from the compass, listed as a coordinator of information from multiple craftsmen. Sarah's father, the tavern keeper, noted as someone who gathered intelligence from loose-tongued British officers and passed it through his daughter. Even young Marcus the silversmith, hanged by his own side after the war, recorded as having provided crucial information about British supply chains before his unjust death. The network had not been a few isolated craftsmen doing questionable work, but a web of ordinary people who had chosen to resist in the only ways available to them. Some had been discovered and killed. Others, like himself, had survived through caution and luck. But all had contributed to something larger than individual survival, even if that contribution would never be acknowledged beyond this secret accounting. The harness maker read through the document twice, memorizing details that seemed important even though he could never share them. Then, following Webb's final instruction written at the document's end, he burned it page by page in his forge, watching years of covert history transform into ash that no future inquiry could uncover. That evening he walked to the Compass, where Sarah was helping her father through the dinner crowd. He waited until she had a moment free, then asked to speak with her privately. In the tavern's back room, surrounded by casks and stored supplies, he told her what he had learned about the network's scope, about her father's role, about the widow's visit, and Webb's final accounting. She listened without interruption, her face revealing little until he finished. Then she sat heavily on a barrel, suddenly looking exhausted. "I knew Father was involved in something. I suspected you were too, more than you ever admitted. But I never understood the scale of it. How many people were risking everything while pretending to be ordinary? Your father never told you." "He told me nothing. Probably to protect me. Same reason you kept secrets. Everyone protecting everyone else by maintaining lies we all pretended to believe." They sat in silence for a time, the noise of the tavern muted by thick walls, both processing the implications of information that had arrived too late to change anything, but early enough to reframe everything. "The woman who came to see me," the harness maker said finally. "Her husband was hanged as a traitor, but he was actually a hero. How many others died like that, condemned by the very people they served? Too many, probably. History is written by those who survive to write it, and they rarely get the details right." He reached for her hand, finding it surprisingly cold despite the room's warmth. "I'm sorry I kept so much from you." "I thought I was protecting our family, but maybe I was just protecting myself from having to justify choices I wasn't sure were right. They were right enough. We survived. Our daughter is safe. The war ends eventually, one way or another. That's more than many can say." Walking home through Philadelphia's darkening streets, the harness maker felt a weight lift that he had carried so long he had forgotten its presence. The secrets were no longer his alone to bear. Webb's accounting had been destroyed, but its essential truth had been witnessed and acknowledged. The network's work would never be officially recognized, but at least a few people knew what had been risked and accomplished, in shadows that history would never illuminate. The next morning, he returned to his workbench with a clarity he had not felt in years. A customer had brought a simple bridle needing repair, honest work without hidden compartments or secret purposes. He examined the leather with the attention Master Cornelius had taught him, identifying where stress had caused cracking, where stitching had loosened, where careful restoration could extend useful life by years. This was who he was, a craftsman who understood that good work endured beyond the circumstances of its creation. The war years had required him to be other things, to serve purposes beyond his trade. But those necessities had not changed his fundamental nature. He had bent to accommodate necessity without breaking, had survived complexity without losing the ability to appreciate simplicity. The detective story that had begun with hidden compartments in a politician's saddle had reached its conclusion. The mystery was solved, the participants revealed, the consequences tallied in lives saved and lives lost. No public resolution would mark the ending, no official acknowledgement that any of it had happened. Just ordinary people returning to ordinary lives, carrying extraordinary knowledge they would never be able to fully share. It was enough. It had to be enough, and standing in his shop with leather in his hands and sunlight slanting through windows, the harness maker found that it was. The war ended not with thunder but with whispers. News arrived in fragments, carried by travelers, and printed in newspapers that contradicted each other about details while agreeing on essentials. Yorktown had fallen. Cornwallis had surrendered. Peace negotiations were underway in Paris, conducted by men in powdered wigs who had never held a musket or hidden messages in saddle leather. The harness maker read these accounts with the detached interest of someone watching a play's final act after the meaningful drama had already concluded. Philadelphia celebrated with the restrained enthusiasm of a city that had learned caution through occupation. There were toasts in taverns, speeches in squares, and relief expressed more through relaxed shoulders than exuberant proclamation. The harness maker attended none of the celebrations, preferring to mark the occasion by finally replacing his shop's worn sign with one bearing his name in letters a skilled sign painter had rendered with appropriate dignity. The gesture was more significant than it appeared. A name displayed publicly represented faith in stability, belief that the future held space for craftsmen to build reputations across years, rather than merely survive through months. He stood in the street studying the sign, feeling Sarah's hand find his, their daughter pressing between them to see what her parents found so absorbing. "It's just a sign," his daughter observed with a child's pragmatism. "It's a promise," he replied, "that we're still here, that we'll continue to be here." Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding, as she always did, the layers of meaning beneath simple words. The years that followed taught him that peace brought its own complications, different from war's dangers, but no less demanding of attention. The new nation assembled itself with arguments and compromises, forming a government that satisfied no one completely and everyone sufficiently. Philadelphia buzzed with constitutional conventions and political debates, important men drafting documents that would shape generations, while the harness maker stitched leather and trained apprentices in the skills that transcended politics. His daughter grew into a capable assistant, then announced at 16 her intention to marry a printer's apprentice she had met through friends. The young man was earnest and hard-working, qualities the harness maker valued above wealth or connection. He gave his blessing and helped establish them in modest rooms, watching his daughter begin the same journey he and Sarah had walked years before. The shop expanded to accommodate a second journeyman, a young man from Virginia, who brought techniques learned in different workshops and was willing to adapt them to Philadelphia's standards. The harness maker taught him not just craft,
but philosophy. The understanding that good work required patience, that shortcuts visible only to the maker still mattered, that reputation was built through consistency rather than brilliance. Thomas died in the shop's 15th year, not dramatically, but quietly, his heart simply stopping one afternoon while he ate his midday meal. The harness maker attended the funeral, spoke briefly about friendship forged through shared trials, and returned home feeling the weight of being among the generation that was no longer young. The world he had known as an apprentice had transformed entirely, its concerns and certainties replaced by new ones that felt simultaneously urgent and ephemeral. Sarah's father followed 2 years later, leaving the tavern to a nephew who lacked his predecessor's instinct for managing difficult customers and useful discretion. The compass slowly changed character, becoming louder and less welcoming, until eventually it closed and was replaced by a draper's shop. The harness maker occasionally walked past the location, remembering evenings spent in its back room, conversations that had mattered intensely and now felt impossibly distant. Ashford reappeared occasionally over the years, always well-dressed, always prosperous, carrying himself with the satisfaction of someone whose risks had been rewarded by history's judgment. He never directly referenced their shared past, but his commissions came with specifications that suggested he remembered who had served him when service was dangerous. The harness maker accepted this patronage with the same professional courtesy he extended to all customers, neither acknowledging nor denying what lay beneath the surface. His apprentices became journeymen, then masters themselves, opening shops in other cities or taking over establishments from retiring craftsmen. He attended their farewells with pride, mixed with the melancholy that comes from watching evidence of time's passage walk out one's door. But new apprentices always arrived, boys from poor families or farms, hungry and hopeful and certain that skilled hands could build futures worth having. To these young people he taught leather work and life work in equal measure, how to read a hide's grain and a customer's character, when to insist on quality, and when to accept that good enough served better than perfect. The value of showing up each day, even when inspiration was absent, because craft was built through accumulation rather than revelation. That kindness cost little and paid dividends impossible to anticipate. One apprentice, a boy named William who had arrived with particularly bad stitching and particularly good questions, asked him once what mattered most in becoming a master craftsman. The harness maker considered the question while running his thumb along a piece of leather he was preparing. Understanding that every piece of work you do teaches you something, even the failures, especially the failures. A master isn't someone who never makes mistakes. He's someone who makes mistakes, learns from them, and doesn't repeat them. Is that how you became a master? That's how I became adequate. Mastery is a destination you approach without ever fully arriving. The moment you think you've mastered something, you've stopped paying attention. William absorbed this with the seriousness of youth encountering wisdom that contradicted simpler certainties. The harness maker watched understanding dawn slowly, the same way he had watched leather accept dye, through patient exposure rather than forceful imposition. His hands developed the stiffness that came for all craftsmen eventually, the joints protesting work they had performed thousands of times. He adapted, finding ways to accomplish tasks that accommodated reduced flexibility, teaching himself again what he had thought he had mastered. The humility was useful, a reminder that even expertise remained provisional, subject to time's steady erosion. Sarah grayed beside him, her practical efficiency undimmed even as her energy for it diminished. They moved through their days with the synchronized ease of people who had spent decades learning each other's patterns, anticipating needs before they were expressed, offering support through presence rather than declaration. The great dramas of their middle years had subsided into comfortable routine punctuated by small pleasures. A good meal, their daughter's visits with grandchildren, the satisfaction of work completed properly. On clear evenings, they still walked through Philadelphia, though shorter distances now, observing how the city continued evolving. Buildings rose where others had stood. Streets were widened and paved. The waterfront expanded to accommodate increasing trade. Young people rushed past with the oblivious energy of those who believed the world had begun with their generation. Unaware, they walked streets where history had been made by people they would never know. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked during one such walk. "The choices you made during the war?" He considered the question carefully, watching lamplighters begin their evening work. "I regret the necessity that made those choices required. But the choices themselves? I did what I could with the understanding I had at the time. That's all anyone can do. Even when the understanding was incomplete. Especially then. Perfect knowledge is a luxury that exists only in hindsight. We act in uncertainty or we don't act at all." She nodded, satisfied or at least accepting. They continued walking in companionable silence, two people who had survived much by staying together through it. In his final year managing the shop, the harness maker took on an apprentice whose father had been a soldier, killed in some battle whose name meant nothing to anyone but those who had fought there. The boy carried his loss quietly, channeling grief into focus on work that required attention to survive. The harness maker recognized something of himself in this intensity and gave the apprentice extra time, teaching him not just leatherwork, but the lessons that could only be transmitted through patient example. "Why do you care so much about getting details right?" the boy asked once. "Most customers won't notice small differences." "Because I notice. The work reflects the worker. If I accept inferior results from myself, I become inferior. Standards maintained in private determine who you become when no one is watching." The apprentice frowned, processing this. "But isn't that exhausting? Always pushing for perfect?" "I didn't say perfect. I said right. There's a difference. Perfect is impossible, and pursuing it leads to paralysis. Right is what your skill and situation allow. That changes as you improve, which means right becomes a moving target you chase throughout your career." These conversations happened between stitches, while cutting patterns, during the ordinary work that filled days and accumulated into lives. The harness maker understood he was passing forward not just technique, but philosophy, a way of approaching craft that had sustained him through decades and complexities that transcended simple trade. When he finally stepped back from daily shop management, transferring responsibility to his senior journeyman while maintaining ownership and advisory role, the transition felt natural rather than forced. He had built something that could continue without him, trained people who understood that quality mattered beyond immediate profit. The shop would endure because its foundation rested on principles rather than personality.
He spent his remaining time in semi-retirement, taking commissions that interested him while refusing those that felt routine, teaching the occasional eager apprentice, and sitting in his shop's window watching Philadelphia's endless parade. The city had grown beyond anything imaginable to the boy who had arrived hungry at Master Cornelius's door those many decades past. But certain fundamentals remained constant. People still needed harnesses and saddles. Craftsmen still transformed raw materials into useful objects. Skill still mattered in a world that sometimes seemed determined to value everything else more highly. On a spring morning remarkable only for its ordinary beauty, the harness maker sat at his workbench, examining a piece of leather he had no particular plan for, simply enjoying its texture and possibility. Sunlight slanted through windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted in patterns too complex for prediction. His hands, gnarled now but still capable, moved across the leather with the unconscious grace of long practice. This was enough. A life built through steady accumulation of skill and experience, choices made, as well as circumstances allowed. Survival that included dignity, and craft that approached art. He had been apprentice and journeyman and master, had served causes larger than himself, while protecting what mattered most, had bent to necessity without breaking entirely. The hidden compartments and secret messages belonged to history now, important once, but no longer his burden to carry. What remained was leather and tools, and the satisfaction of work done properly, of knowledge passed forward, of having been useful in times when usefulness took many forms. Outside, Philadelphia continued its transformation into something both familiar and foreign. The city of his youth becoming the city of his old age, through changes too gradual to notice individually, but impossible to miss in aggregate. New apprentices would arrive tomorrow or next week, carrying hunger and hope, and hands waiting to learn what his generation had preserved to teach. The craft would endure. That mattered more than any individual craftsman, though each contributed their piece to the continuity. He had done his part, built his small section of the endless wall that separated chaos from order, and could step back knowing the wall would hold. That knowledge brought peace deeper than relief, satisfaction that transcended pride. He was a harness maker. Everything else had been temporary necessity or historical accident. But the craft remained, true and constant, sufficient unto itself. In the shop's quiet morning light, surrounded by tools worn smooth by decades of use, he ran his fingers once more across the leather and smiled.